Hi dear students, welcome to Kavita's NEET classes. In this lecture, we shall discuss about an important gland of the human endocrine system, that is the pituitary gland. So we will be discussing about the location, the structure of the pituitary gland, what are the hormones it synthesizes, and what are the functions of all these hormones which it synthesizes. We should also discuss about the changes which will happen if there is an increase or decrease in these hormones also, that is the disorders which are caused if there is either an increase in the hormones or decrease in the hormones which are synthesized and secreted by the pituitary gland. So even before we start discussion of the pituitary gland, I would advise you to go through the lecture on hypothalamus first. I have already made a detailed lecture on hypothalamus, which is also a very important gland of the endocrine system, and it is already on my channel. So you can first go through that video before coming and watching the video on pituitary gland. I will also link it for you here in the I button. Pituitary gland. It is called as the master gland, isn't it? Pituitary gland is also called as the master gland. It is the smallest gland in the body. So you can get a question in your examination asking you which is the smallest gland of our endocrine system. And the options can be pituitary gland, hypothalamus, pineal gland, and one more. So then your right answer will be pituitary gland. So pituitary gland is the smallest gland of our endocrine system, and it just weighs around half a gram. Can you believe this? A pituitary gland just weighs around half a gram, that is 0.5 gram. It is a tiny sized gland which weighs just half a gram. But its function is very important in our endocrine system. Though it is very tiny, it has very important functions in our endocrine system. So pituitary gland is also called as the hypophysis. So another name for pituitary gland is hypophysis. Hypophysis. Why is it called hypophysis? Hypo, the word hypo in Greek terminology means under or below or living under. So it is derived from the Greek word hypo, which means under or living under or below, and the word physis, physis, which means growth. Okay, so the word hypophysis can be broken down into hypo and physis. In Greek terminology, the word hypo means below or under or living under. And the word physis means growth. Since the pituitary gland is located just below the hypothalamus, isn't it? The pituitary gland is located just below the hypothalamus. It is rightly called as hypophysis, wherein hypo means living under or below and physis means growth. So here they mean, when they say pituitary gland, when they call pituitary gland as hypophysis, it means it is a gland which is situated below the hypothalamus. Okay. The pituitary gland is located in a bony cavity called as sella turcica. The word sella turcica means chair-like. The word sella turcica means chair-like. So this pituitary gland is located in a bony cavity which resembles a chair. That chair kind of bony cavity is called as sella turcica, and it is attached to the hypothalamus by a stalk called as infundibulum. So these are very, very important from your NEET examination point of view. There you might get a question asking, where is the pituitary gland located? It is located in sella turcica and other options, and it is linked to the hypothalamus through infundibulum. So you definitely have to remember these terms, sella turcica, infundibulum, because it is very important. Okay, the pituitary is the smallest gland of our endocrine system. It is situated just below the hypothalamus and hence it is called as hypophysis, and it is located in a bony cavity called as sella turcica, and it is attached to the hypothalamus. Here you can see this is the hypothalamus. This is the hypothalamus and this is the pituitary gland. So it is attached to the hypothalamus through a stalk-like structure called as the infundibulum. Can you remember all this? Then anatomically we can divide pituitary gland into two lobes, that is anterior lobe and posterior lobe. Even before discussing that, let me tell you how the hypothalamus is connected with the pituitary gland. So this is the hypothalamus and this is the pituitary gland, right? This is this region here. This region is the anterior pituitary and this region, which I am marking in lines, is the posterior pituitary. So this is the anterior pituitary and this region is the posterior pituitary. The hypothalamus is connected, it is connected to the anterior pituitary through the hypophyseal portal veins. Here you can see red color veins which are entering into the anterior pituitary, isn't it? These are the hypophyseal veins. So the hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland. So the hormones which are secreted here are enable or it is capable of controlling the anterior pituitary by these hypophyseal veins. So the hypothalamus is connected to the anterior pituitary through the hypophyseal veins. Then what about the posterior pituitary gland? So here in the hypothalamus we have neurosecretory cells called as nuclei. We have neurosecretory cells in the hypothalamus. These are the neurosecretory cells. These neurosecretory cells synthesize neurohormones. Okay, these neurohormones are stored in the posterior pituitary gland. Okay, the axon terminals of these neurosecretory cells terminate here in the posterior pituitary, and whatever hormones that are synthesized by these neurosecretory cells called nuclei, okay, those hormones are collected and it is stored here in the posterior pituitary. That is where these neurosecretory cells, the terminals of these axon end, there are vesicles in which the hormones which are synthesized by the neurosecretory cells of the hypothalamus are stored in the posterior pituitary. Okay, I will explain once again. The anterior pituitary, this is the posterior pituitary and this is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is connected to the anterior pituitary through the hypophyseal portal veins and it regulates the anterior pituitary gland. Then we have the neurosecretory cells in the hypothalamus. These neurosecretory cells secrete hormones called as neurohormones, and the axons of these neurosecretory cells end in this posterior pituitary. So in these axon terminals there are vesicles. Okay, in these vesicles the hormones which are synthesized and secreted by the neurosecretory cells are stored over here. Okay, So these vesicles are called as herring bodies. These vesicles are called as herring bodies. So please remember, the posterior pituitary is not capable of synthesizing any hormones. This is a very important question which has been repeated in NEET examination several times. So they will give you a question asking which lobe of the pituitary synthesizes what hormones, match the following. Or they might give you the three different parts of the pituitary and they might give you a list of hormones and ask you to match it. So please remember, it is only the anterior pituitary which is capable of synthesizing and secreting hormones, whereas the posterior pituitary does not synthesize and secrete any hormones. It is only capable of storing the hormones which are synthesized by the neurosecretory cells in the hypothalamus. The axons and the terminals end over here in the posterior pituitary, and there are vesicles called as herring bodies, and it is in these herring bodies that the hormones are stored and they are utilized. Fine. So did you understand how the hypothalamus is connected to the pituitary gland? The hypothalamus is connected to the anterior pituitary through the hypophyseal portal veins, and it is connected to the posterior pituitary through the neurosecretory cell. The axon terminals of neurosecretory cell connect with the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. So anatomically speaking, the pituitary gland has two lobes, that is the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe. So anterior lobe comprises around 75% of the pituitary gland. So anterior lobe is 75% and posterior lobe is just 25% of the pituitary. Okay, so anterior portion or the anterior lobe is huge. It is 75%. It comprises 75% of the pituitary, whereas the posterior lobe comprises only 25% of the pituitary. So keep this also in mind. Okay, and also it is the only the anterior lobe of the pituitary which is capable of synthesizing and secreting the hormones, whereas the posterior pituitary cannot synthesize hormones. It only stores the hormones which are synthesized by the neurosecretory cells in vesicles called as herring bodies. Now, so anatomically we can divide the pituitary gland into anterior pituitary and posterior pituitary. However, the pituitary gland is composed of three parts. What are the three parts? The first part is called as pars distalis. Pars distalis. What do we mean by pars distalis? In Latin, pars means part. In Latin, pars means part and distalis means it is at a distance from the point of origin of that gland or region or tissue, whatever. Okay, so distalis means distant. So this is one portion of the pituitary, that is pars distalis, where pars means part and distalis means it is at a distance from the point of origin or the center of the origin. The next part is pars intermedia. Pars intermedia, again here pars means part and intermedia. Why is it called intermedia? Because it is this intermedia or this part which separates the anterior and the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. That is why it is called as pars intermedia. Then there is another part, the third part, which is called as pars nervosa. Pars nervosa. So what is pars nervosa? Again in pars nervosa, pars means part and nervosa. So here pars nervosa is the posterior pituitary gland because it is connected to the hypothalamus through the neurosecretory cells. It has these neurosecretory cells which are connecting it, and it is involved in those functions. It is called as nervosa. Got it? So the pituitary gland is composed of three parts. The first one is pars distalis, second one is pars intermedia, and the third one is pars nervosa. The pars distalis and the pars intermedia together form the anterior pituitary. Anterior pituitary. Okay. The pars intermedia is almost merged with the pars distalis. Hence, we do not classify them into three different lobes. We just combine both of them and we call them as the anterior pituitary. Okay, did you get it? The pars intermedia is very tiny, it is very thin, and it is almost merged with the pars distalis in human beings. That is why we consider them as a single lobe called the anterior lobe of the pituitary. Then we have the pars nervosa, which is a third part. This is the posterior pituitary. Are you all following? Okay. So the pituitary gland is composed of three parts. The first part is pars distalis and the second one is the pars intermedia. Since they both are merged together, we combine them together and we call them as anterior pituitary. And then the other third part is pars nervosa, which is called as the posterior pituitary. So in this picture, here we will have pars distalis and then a tiny layer of pars intermedia over here, and this is pars nervosa. So totally we have anterior pituitary and posterior pituitary. Anterior pituitary is composed of pars distalis and pars intermedia, and the posterior pituitary is composed of part nervosa. So this is also an important question from your NEET exam point of view. So there you might get these three as the answer options: pars distalis, pars intermedia, and pars nervosa. And the question might be, which of these are capable of synthesizing and secreting hormones, and or mark which of these does not synthesize and secrete hormones. So then the answer will be pars nervosa. So they might not give you straight away in the question as posterior pituitary or anterior pituitary. Instead, they will use these terms: pars distalis, pars intermedia, and pars nervosa. So these are ways in which they can confuse you or make the questions look little bit tricky. So please do not get confused. Anterior pituitary is composed of pars distalis and pars intermedia, and posterior pituitary is composed of pars nervosa. It's as simple as that. Okay. So the anterior pituitary is called as adenohypophysis, and the posterior pituitary is called as neurohypophysis. Here, adenohypophysis comprises of pars distalis and pars intermedia, isn't it? Adenohypophysis is nothing but anterior pituitary. It is composed of pars distalis and pars intermedia, and neurohypophysis is composed of pars nervosa. So why do we call this adenohypophysis? So I told you what is the meaning of hypophysis. Pituitary gland is called as hypophysis, isn't it? Adeno, according to Greek terminology, adeno means gland. The word adeno in Greek terminology means gland, and hypo means lying under, and physis means growth, isn't it? So adenohypophysis means anterior pituitary. Okay, and neurohypophysis because it is mainly connected to the neurosecretory cells of the hypothalamus. That is why it is called as neurohypophysis. So did you understand the division of the pituitary gland into adenohypophysis and neurohypophysis? The adenohypophysis consists of the pars distalis and pars intermedia, and the neurohypophysis consists of the pars nervosa. Isn't it? So this is about the structure and the location of the pituitary gland. So where the pituitary gland is located and what are the different regions, what are the two different lobes of the pituitary gland and what are they comprised of. Fine, we shall move on. Now that we know the structure and the location of the pituitary gland, let's look into the functions of the pituitary gland. So what are the different parts of the pituitary gland and what are their functions? I told you we already have anterior pituitary, which is pars distalis. So the anterior pituitary secretes these hormones such as growth hormone, prolactin, thyroid stimulating hormone, adenocorticotropic hormone, luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. So I would like to give you one important tip now. Whenever you are studying about the endocrine system, the various glands of the endocrine system, few important points you need to definitely keep in your mind. First is the name of the gland. Second one, what is the structure and the location of the gland? That is, what is it composed of, if there are different lobes and all these things, and then where it is located. So the first point will be name of the gland. Second will be the structure and the location. Third, what is the function? That is, the function of these glands is to secrete hormones, isn't it? So what are the hormones which this gland is secreting? So what is the function of these hormones? So what activities do they perform? That is, are they regulating any other gland, or are they inducing growth, or are they acting upon the thyroid gland? Whatever. So what are the hormones which that gland is synthesizing, and what is the function of each of these hormones, and where is the target of all these hormones? So where these hormones are going and reaching, and where it is creating a function or some activity. So that is called as target cells, isn't it? So these 4 points are very important and you will get it as match the following questions. So in the question you will have the first column will have the different glands. Okay. Then in the second column you will have the hormones secreted by those glands. And in the third section you will have the target cells which they are going to go and target. So these three, under this you will have different glands. One will be the pituitary gland, the second one will be the pineal gland, and the third one can be the hypothalamus, so on. So you will have to match the right gland with the right hormone and the target cell which it is going to target. Isn't it? So this kind of questions you can find almost every year in your NEET examination. There have been several questions in this pattern which have been asked in the previous year examinations. So please keep these points in mind. So name of the gland, what is the structure and the function, that is where they are located in the human body and what is their structure, and then what are the hormones which they synthesize, and what is the function of those hormones, that is also very important, and finally where they are acting upon, that is those hormones, where are they going and targeting, which cells are they acting upon. This is called as target. You will get that as different columns and you will have to match the right gland with the right hormone and the right target cell, and then you will have options as 1, 2, 3, 4 and you have to mark the right one over there. Okay, so can you keep these points in mind when you're preparing for this chapter, endocrine system? Fine, let's move on. So the anterior pituitary, which is also called as the anterior pituitary, is composed of pars distalis and pars intermedia, isn't it? So here it should have been, instead of anterior pituitary, it should have been pars distalis, isn't it? isn't it? Fine. So the pars distalis, this part of the pituitary gland secretes the hormones like growth hormone, prolactin, thyroid stimulating hormone, adenocorticotropic hormone, luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. That is, the first part of the pituitary secretes these hormones. Next is the pars intermedia, that is the part of the pituitary gland which separates the anterior lobe from the posterior lobe. Since it is almost merged with the pars distalis, it also comes under the anterior pituitary gland. So the pars intermedia secretes a hormone called as melanocyte stimulating hormone, isn't it? Next comes the third part, that is pars nervosa, or the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. I already told you it does not synthesize any hormones. It only stores and releases the hormones which are synthesized by the neurosecretory cells of the hypothalamus. So it stores and releases the hormones synthesized by the neurosecretory cells. Those hormones are called oxytocin and vasopressin. This question has been asked several times in NEET examination. So the question can be, they will give you the three different parts, that is pars distalis, pars intermedia, and pars nervosa. Okay, and then here in another column they will give you a list of the hormones, which can be any of these hormones like growth hormone, prolactin, melanocyte and all these things, and they will ask you to match which hormone is synthesized by which part of the pituitary gland. Or alternatively, they can even give this, and the fourth option can be, say, anterior pituitary. So here the question can be, which of this part of pituitary gland is not capable of synthesizing any hormones? Then the right answer will be pars nervosa, because it is the posterior gland of the pituitary which does not synthesize any hormones. It only stores and releases the hormones such as oxytocin and vasopressin, which are synthesized by the neurosecretory cells of the hypothalamus, and here in the neurohypophysis it is saved in vesicles, okay, where the axon terminals are ending. There are vesicles in which the hormones such as oxytocin and vasopressin are stored, and those vesicles are called as Herring bodies. So there have been questions on Herring bodies also in your examination. So do not forget Herring bodies. What are Herring bodies? Herring bodies are the vesicles in the posterior pituitary gland where the hormones like oxytocin and vasopressin, which are secreted by the hypothalamus, is stored and released. Got it? So did you all understand so much? What are the hormones which are synthesized and secreted by pars distalis? What are the hormones which are synthesized and secreted by pars intermedia? And what are the hormones which are not synthesized by the neurohypophysis or the posterior pituitary gland, instead only stored and released? We shall be discussing about each of these hormones. First, we shall discuss about the hormones secreted by pars distalis. First is the growth hormone. The growth hormone stimulates the growth of the organism, as the name suggests. Next one is the prolactin. Prolactin is the hormone which regulates the growth of the mammary gland and also secretion of milk from the mammary gland. Next is the thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone, it regulates the gland called as thyroid gland, which is present in our neck region. Here you can see this is the thyroid gland. It is a butterfly shaped gland which is present in our neck. So the thyroid stimulating hormone regulates the synthesis and secretion of hormones from the thyroid gland. So what are the hormones secreted by the thyroid gland? They are tetraiodothyronine, which is also called as thyroxine, or you can also call it as T4. And the other hormone is triiodothyronine, which is also called as T3. Okay, so these two hormones, one is the T4 hormone which is called tetraiodothyronine or thyroxine, and the other one is the triiodothyronine which is also called as T3. So T3 and T4 are two important hormones secreted by the thyroid gland, and what are the functions of this and much more details we will be discussing when we discuss the topic thyroid gland. So as of now you need to know that the thyroid stimulating hormone regulates the thyroid gland, and these are the two important hormones which are secreted by the thyroid gland. So thyroid gland, for the good functioning of the thyroid gland, iodine is very essential, isn't it? So that is why we take iodized salt in our diet. So what happens if there is a deficiency of iodine in our diet? Then you will get the condition called as hypothyroidism. So when there is a deficiency of iodine in our diet, we get a condition called as hypothyroidism, which has few physiological problems on our body. Then if there is excess of iodine in our diet, if we consume excess of iodine, then again there is a difference in the amount of thyroid hormones that is secreted, and that leads to a condition called as hyperthyroidism. Hyperthyroidism. So deficiency of iodine causes hypothyroidism, and surplus of iodine causes hyperthyroidism. So there can also be swelling of the thyroid gland, and that condition is called as goiter, isn't it? So we shall discuss more about all this when we discuss the thyroid gland. Next is the adenocorticotropic hormone. The adenocorticotropic hormone, it regulates the synthesis of steroid hormones called glucocorticoids by the adrenal cortex. What is adrenal cortex? See here, you can see this is the kidney. This region is the kidney. Here you have the structure called as the adrenal gland. So the adenocorticotropic hormone regulates the synthesis of glucocorticoids by this adrenal cortex. Okay. So growth hormone, prolactin, thyroid stimulating hormone, and adrenocorticotropic hormone. Next is the luteinizing hormone. The luteinizing hormone and the follicle stimulating hormone stimulate the gonadal activity, and hence they are called as gonadotropins. So luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone are called as gonadotropins because they stimulate the gonadal activity. What are gonads? Gonads are the organs which produce the gametes, isn't it? So in men the gonad is testis, and in women or females the gonad is ovary. So since the luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone are active in regulating the gonads, they are called as gonadotropins. So what does luteinizing hormone do in males? In males, the luteinizing hormone is responsible for the synthesis and secretion of androgens. And the follicle stimulating hormone along with the androgen is responsible for the process of spermatogenesis. What is spermatogenesis? The process of production of the sperm is called as spermatogenesis. So it is the follicle stimulating hormone which is responsible for the synthesis and secretion of androgens in the testes, and the follicle stimulating hormone along with the androgen is responsible for the process of spermatogenesis. Next, what is the function of luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone in females? So the luteinizing hormone is responsible for the process of ovulation. So ovulation is the process by which the mature Graafian follicle is released from the ovary, or the mature egg is released from the ovary. So it is the luteinizing hormone which stimulates that. Next is the follicle stimulating hormone, which is responsible for the growth and development of the ovarian follicles. Okay, so luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, they are regulating the gonadal activity, and hence they are called as gonadotropins. Here you can see, this is the ovary, this is the ovum or the mature Graafian follicle which is released from the ovary by the process of ovulation, and then this is the corpus luteum. The maintenance of the corpus luteum is also carried out by the gonadotropins. Okay, so much more about this we shall be discussing when we discuss the chapter reproductive system. Okay. Next, moving on to the hormones which are secreted by pars intermedia. So it is the melanocyte stimulating hormone. The melanocyte stimulating hormone stimulates the melanocytes. Melanocytes are the cells which contain the pigment called melanin, which is responsible for giving us the skin color. So it controls the pigmentation of the skin. So it is the melanocyte stimulating hormone which acts upon the melanocytes and then controls the skin pigmentation. Next is the posterior lobe of pituitary, which is also called as neurohypophysis. As I already told you, neurohypophysis, or the posterior gland of pituitary, posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, does not synthesize any hormones on its own. It only stores and releases two hormones called as oxytocin and vasopressin. Oxytocin is a hormone which brings about contraction of the smooth muscle cells. So oxytocin is very much effective in bringing about contraction of the tissues in the uterus during the time of childbirth. So whenever pregnant woman, during the time of when it is time for her to deliver a child and she does not get into labor, then artificially the doctors will give her an injection of oxytocin in order to bring about the contraction of the tissues in the uterus. So you must have also observed that whenever people milk, that is extract milk from cows and buffaloes, they will inject a artificially made form of oxytocin to the cow's udder. So the reason for that is it will give more milk if you put this injection. Fine. So vasopressin is also called as antidiuretic. So vasopressin is called as antidiuretic because this vasopressin acts on the kidneys so that there will be more absorption of electrolytes and water in order to prevent the loss of water in the form of urine. Okay, vasopressin acts on the kidneys in order to reabsorb water. So for water reabsorption and reabsorption of electrolytes in order to prevent loss of water in the form of urine. Hence it is also called as antidiuretic. So it is oxytocin and vasopressin which are stored and they are released by this posterior lobe of pituitary gland. So now let's briefly look into what are the disorders which can be caused if there is a difference in the amount of hormones that are synthesized and secreted by the pituitary gland. So, pituitary dwarfism. So, when there is very low levels of the growth hormone produced by the pituitary gland, it leads to a condition called as pituitary dwarfism, wherein the person will have stunted growth. They will be short, they will have short limbs, that is legs and hands will be very short, and they will have a short stature. However, they will be proportionate. Next is the gigantism. So when there's excess of growth hormone which is secreted by the pituitary gland, then what happens is the person will have a very tall stature and they will have a tall a tall figure. So they will have very long legs, hands and a huge gigantic figure, right? Still here also it will be proportionate. Next is acromegaly. When there is excess synthesis of growth hormones after the person has reached adolescence. After adolescence age, if there is excess secretion of growth hormone by the pituitary, it leads to disproportionate growth of hands, the feet, hands and also bones of the face. So that leads to disproportionate growth in the face, hands and feet. Here you can see how it is disproportionate, isn't it? So this happens when there is excess growth hormone after the person reaches adolescence. Then this condition is called as acromegaly. Next is diabetes insipidus. Diabetes insipidus, here it happens due to deficiency of antidiuretic hormone. So when there is a deficiency, it is characterized by excessive dilute urine. That is, when vasopressin hormone is very less, then what happens? There is less of water reabsorption and there is excessive dilute urine, and this condition is called as diabetes insipidus. Then comes Simmons disease. So when there is a degeneration of the anterior lobe of pituitary, you can get this disease called as Simmons disease, where the face becomes dry, wrinkled and there is premature aging. Okay. Then next is high blood level of ADH. When there is excessive secretion of antidiuretic hormone, it's lead to a condition where there is excessive dilute blood and low blood plasma. This condition is happening when there is high blood level of ADH. So these are the various pituitary disorders. So the optimal and the proper functioning of pituitary gland is very, very essential if you should not get any of these disorders. Pituitary gland and overall the human endocrine system is a very important chapter for NEET examination. So I will request you to concentrate well and read it as per how I have explained and the tips that I have given, what you have to concentrate mostly and what kind of questions you can expect in the examination. Further, I will also be discussing questions from this entire chapter in my future lectures. We shall also discuss few more important glands of the human endocrine system. So if you have any queries, you can post it in the comment section below, and for more such interesting lectures, you can subscribe to my channel and also connect with me on social media. Until I meet you in the next lecture, take care, have a good day.